The time traveller, for so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite matter to us. His grey eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated.
I'm going to talk about the greatest problem mankind has to face.
The first year was undoubtedly the most important, 1884, because he was taught by Thomas Henry Huxley. Huxley was Darwin's bulldog, one of perhaps the most famous man of science in Victorian London, an expositor of natural selection and of Darwinism, a man of extraordinary charisma, to whom, in fact, Wells eventually sent a copy of The Time Machine as a gift.
The Chronic Argonauts, he has a stupid name, Moses Nebo Gitfell. Wells, I think quite rightly, ditched that.
Turning his head back, he was stricken rigid with horror by the swift, noiseless apparition of Nebo Gibfell, ghastly pale and with red-stained hands, crouching upon a strange-looking metallic platform, the pure ivory and gleaming nickel and shining ebony of the platform. He arose from his knees, as a bona fide mechanical contrivance, took a curiously curved lever in his hand and pulled it vanished. I knew I was an anachronic man. 30 years of unremitting toil and deepest thought among the hidden things of matter and form and life, and then that, the Chronic Argo, the ship that sails through time.
If the Chronic Argonauts was going to provide the escape from obscurity that Wells so desperately craved, then it needed some work. Wells started rewriting from scratch, framing his improbable story within the familiar setting of London's clubland, and ditching his hero's rather unusual name.
This could be the beginning of the end for the human race, for what men first thought were meteors or the...
took the creative magic of George Pal and the fabulous production know-how of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to catapult you through time into a world that is yet to be. What are the people like? Ah, the shape of things to come. It's lovely Yvette Mimieux. And what happens when boy meets girl thousands of years hence?
How do they wear their hair?
Who?
The women of your time.
Up like that?
Show me.
Is this the human race of the future? Or is this the Morlocks?
Tell me about the time machine.
Time Machine was written by H.G. Wells in 1894. It was later adapted to a motion picture by George Pal and a stage musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber, which ran on Broadway for 23 years.
We're so familiar with it. We grow up with time travel. We have time travel in cartoons. We know all of the jokes. We know the paradoxes. Before H.G. Wells, there was almost no conception of time travel. Nobody put the two words together. The Time Machine, his 1895 book, is really the first time people thought there could be such a thing as a time machine.
There have been plenty of time travel stories before H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, but they all depend on chance or divine intervention. So somebody lies down and goes to sleep and is transported into the future. Somebody goes to visit a god. There's several sort of myths, Hindu myths as well, Indian myths as well, that have basically people going to visit the divine, and while they're in heaven, not noticing that in fact time has passed by on Earth more swiftly than they'd expected, and they are effectively in their own future.
Paramount makes entertainment history on a grand scale, presenting the outstanding star of our time as one of the best-loved characters of all time, Mark Twain's immortal jester, the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court.
I have here, Your Majesty, a common, ordinary twig. Presto! Imagine what I could do with the tree.
So you have all of these tales of travelling forward in time, but there's no control and there's no direction. And what matters for Wells is the fact that this is a machine. This is something that is produced by humans and is under human control.
Before the late Victorian era, it was practically impossible for people to conceive of time travel. And I say it was impossible because they didn't. Why it wasn't a natural idea is, imagine in the 16th century, you're a farmer, let's say, and somebody asks you, what do you think life is going to be like for your grandchildren? You would say, what do you mean? That question doesn't make any sense. The world wasn't changing fast enough for anybody to have a sense of technological progress, much less a sense that technological progress is kind of inevitable, that we are on a conveyor belt bringing us inexorably into the future, right? So you can see that start to change during the Industrial Revolution. The pace of technological change accelerates, and it accelerates to a point when suddenly people can look around and become aware that things actually do change fast.
The writer Nalla Hopkinson once defined science fiction as that branch of literature which deals with the consequences for humanity of the use of tools. And the machine is a tool for manipulating time and being able to move through time in a controlled fashion. It's, I always read it and think, well, this is basically H.G. Wells, the cyclist, the cycling enthusiast, and effectively the handles are the kind of the handlebars and the seat is the saddle kind of thing.
Wells is pretty explicit about this. Much later in his life, he points out that the diamond frame bicycle and his story, The Time Machine, appeared at exactly the same moment. And the saddle and the seat and the handlebars absolutely speak to this extraordinary revolution in social relations that cheap and affordable bicycling.
I have a big machine nearly finished in there. He indicated the laboratory. And when that is put together, I mean to have a journey on my own account. Would you like to see it? And therewith, taking the lamp in his hand, he led the way down the long, draughty corridor to his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer, broad head in silhouette, the dance of the shadows, how we all followed him, puzzled but incredulous, and how there in the laboratory we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism which we had seen vanish before our eyes. Parts were of nickel, parts of ivory, parts had certainly been filed or sawn out of rock crystal. The thing was generally complete, but the twisted crystalline bars lay unfinished upon the bench beside some sheets of drawings, and I took one up for a better look at it. Quartz, it seemed to be. Upon that machine, said the time traveller, holding the lamp aloft, I intend to explore time. Is that plain? I was never more serious in my life.
One of the striking things about Time Machine for us reading it now is that the time traveller doesn't go into the past. This is a book about our possible future and therefore confessedly conjectural.
I think what's really important about the introduction, or the first part of the book, is that it's, you know, science fiction is often criticised for not being realist, whatever that means, but this is a profoundly realist introduction. You are within the domestic sphere.
The fire burnt brightly, and there was that luxurious after-dinner atmosphere when thought runs gracefully free of the trammels of precision. We sat and lazily admired his earnestness over this new paradox, as we thought it. You must follow me carefully, he said. I shall have to controvert one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school, is founded on a misconception. Is not that rather a large thing to expect us to begin upon? Said Philby, an argumentative person with red hair.
A bit like Sherlock Holmes is set up, isn't it?
It's that domestication that makes it possible for Wells to domesticate the impossible.
The domestication of the impossible, again, that's Wells's phrase, which is cinema. A few months after the appearance of Time Machine, he was contacted by an electrical engineer called Robert Paul, who was Thomas Alva Edison's cinema agent in London. And what Paul wanted to do was to turn the Time Machine into a movie. An extraordinary vision. Wells and Paul collaborate. Paul wrote a patent, as far as we can tell, on a machine for reproducing the effects of time travel. It wasn't, in other words, just that Wells had evoked a machine, but that the experience of travelling on such a machine began to conform ever more closely with the experience the Victorian audience in London was beginning to have in 1895 and 96 of early cinema.
I drew a breath, set my teeth, gripped the starting lever with both hands and went off with a thud. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. I'm afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time travelling. They are excessively unpleasant. There is a feeling exactly like that one has upon a switchback, of helpless, headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation, too, of an imminent smash. As I put on pace, night followed day like the flapping of a black wing. I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping it every minute, and every minute making a day. I supposed the laboratory had been destroyed and I had come into the open air. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, but I was already going too fast to be aware of any moving things. The twinkling succession of darkness and light was excessively painful to the eye. Then, in the intermittent darkness, I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters from new to full, and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, still gaining velocity, the palpitation of night and day merged into one continuous greyness. The unpleasant sensations of the start were less poignant now. They merged at last into a kind of hysterical exhilaration. I remarked, indeed, a clumsy swaying of the machine for which I was unable to account. But my mind was too confused to attend to it, so with a kind of madness growing upon me, I flung myself into futurity. strange developments of humanity, what wonderful advances upon our rudimentary civilization I thought might not appear when I came to look nearly into the dim, elusive world that raced and fluctuated before my eyes. I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our own time, and yet as it seemed built of glimmer and mist. I saw richer green flow up the hillside and remain there without any wintry intermission. Even through the veil of my confusion, the earth seemed very fair. And so my mind came round to the business of stopping. Like an impatient fool, I lugged over the lever, and incontinently the machine went reeling over, and I was flung headlong through the air. I stood up and looked around me. A colossal figure, carved apparently in some white stone, loomed indistinctly beyond the rhododendrons through the hazy downpour. As the columns of hail grew thinner, I saw the white figure more distinctly. It was very large, for a silver birch tree touched its shoulder. It was of white marble, in shape something like a winged sphinx, with the wings spread so that it seemed to hover.
Hopkinson once defined science fiction as that branch of literature which deals with the consequences for humanity of the use of tools. And the machine is a tool for manipulating time and being able to move through time in a controlled fashion. It depends on what you think, in a sense, science fiction is for, or that genre of, or that mode of engagement is for. If you think of it as something that's as a kind of sugar-coated way of increasing the public understanding of science, and people are sometimes surprised when they read The Time Machine to find there's actually so little detail on exactly how it happened. You know, how you don't actually get to find out an awful lot about how the time machine works.
In the late 19th century, the genre of science fiction was coming into being. Jules Verne had been writing for many years and wasn't particularly popular in English until around the late 19th century, when H.G. Wells was emerging as a science fiction writer. They're often paired together as the kind of co-founders of science fiction as a genre.
Verne and Wells had this rivalry, and Verne held H.G. Wells in a kind of contempt because Wells didn't do the science. When Jules Verne shot a man to the moon, he did all the research and all the math, and they figured out that there would have to be a rocket, and the rocket would have to go from Cape Canaveral, or it would have to go from Texas, either way, and he figured out, and then it would end up in the ocean, and there would be a rescue at sea, and he got the whole thing perfect. And H.G. Wells just invented a substance that cut off all gravity and called it cavorite, you know, and Jules Verne said, where's the science in that? That's just, you know, that's fiction, but it isn't science fiction.
This is how it began.
This is a solemn moment in the history of mankind.
We're off!
The purpose of Wells sending a man to the moon was to explore a kind of different civilization that existed on the moon, whereas Verne was simply interested in the ability to send people to the moon and back as an end in itself. So their approaches to science fiction were entirely different.
What really distinguishes Wells, I think, as a writer of science fiction is that he's a very good writer.
Everybody remembers the section of the Eloi and the Morlocks, yeah, which is a sort of a cartoon of where evolution might take the British social class system.
He was a slight creature, perhaps 4 feet high, clad in a purple tunic girdled at the waist with a leather belt. He struck me as being a very beautiful and graceful creature, but indescribably frail. His flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful kind of consumptive, that hectic beauty of which we used to hear so much. Then someone suggested that their plaything should be exhibited in the nearest building, so I was led past the Sphinx of white marble towards a vast grey edifice of fretted stone. The time machine was left deserted on the turf among the rhododendrons.
beauty or sophistication in a species aren't in themselves intrinsically rewarded by evolution. What evolution rewards is fitness for a species' environment. And the environment of humanity becomes very managed, becomes very calm, becomes very controlled, becomes very stable, and therefore it's not to humanity's advantage anymore to be intelligent.
This is a contrast between aesthetes and Puritans. And it's worth remembering that Time Machine is published the month of Oscar Wilde's trials. The themes of aesthetics, of degeneration, of languor, and social and natural corruption are all over the newspapers at this point. And the bipolar quality of Wells's future is capturing not just biology but also politics of the time.
So watching, I began to put my interpretation upon the things I'd seen. It seemed to me that I'd happened upon humanity on the wane. The ruddy sunset set me thinking of the sunset of mankind. For countless years I judged there had been no danger of war or violence, no danger from wild beasts, no need of toil. No doubt the exquisite beauty of the buildings I saw was the outcome of the last surgings of the now purposeless energy of mankind before it settled down into perfect harmony with the conditions under which it lived.
You! All of you! I'm going back to my own time. I won't even bother to tell of the useless struggle, the hopeless future.
Then my eye travelled along to the figure of the white sphinx upon the pedestal of bronze, growing distinct as the light of the rising moon grew brighter. There was the tangle of rhododendron bushes, black in the pale light, and there was the little lawn where I had landed. I looked at the lawn again. The time machine was gone. At once, like a lash across the face, came the possibility of losing my own age, of being left helpless in this strange new world. I found a groove ripped in the turf midway between the pedestal of the Sphinx and the marks of my arrival. The pedestal was hollow. There were no handles or keyholes, but possibly the panels, if they were doors, as I supposed, opened from within. One thing was clear enough to my mind. It took no great mental effort to infer that my time machine was inside that pedestal.
So you have literally useless infantile aristocrats living on the surface, having short, happy, beautiful lives, and then sort of brutal, thuggish proletarian Morlocks living underground who come up and eat them from time to time. I think there's a certain relish there.
At once the eyes darted sideways and something white ran past me. I turned with my heart in my mouth and saw a queer little ape-like figure, its head held down in a peculiar manner, running across the sunlit space behind me. It blundered against a block of granite, staggered aside, and in a moment was hidden in a black shadow beneath another pile of ruined masonry. Could this thing have vanished down the shaft? I lit a match, and looking down, I saw a small, white, moving creature with large, bright eyes which regarded me steadfastly as it retreated. It made me shudder. It was so like a human spider. It was clambering down the wall, and now I saw for the first time a number of metal foot and hand rests forming a kind of ladder down the shaft. Then the light burned my fingers and fell out of my hand, going out as it dropped. And when I had lit another, the little monster had disappeared. The too perfect security of the overworlders had led them to a slow degeneration, to a general dwindling in size, strength, and intelligence. That I could see clearly enough already. What had happened to the underworlders I did not yet suspect, but from what I had seen of the Morlocks, that, by the way, was the name by which these creatures were called, I could imagine that the modification of the human type was even more profound than among the Eloi, the beautiful race that I already knew. Then came troublesome doubts. Why had the Morlocks taken my time machine? For I felt it was they who had taken it. Why, too, if the Eloi were masters, could they not restore the machine to me? And why were they so terribly afraid of the dark?
No, there is nothing progressive or salvation-oriented in the bulk of the Time Machine story, and not only that, but things get even worse than that. It seems to me the driving force of the Time Machine is what he calls the tragedy of extinction. The main lesson is undoubtedly pessimistic. This is what he tells Huxley when he sends Huxley a copy of the book. He says, this is about the contradiction between plenty and intelligence. If you want to be ingenious, you have to struggle. If social development removes the pressure of struggle, it will also divide us between Downton Abbey and the Satanic Mills. And the argument is partly, do not suppose that natural selection on its own will give us or guarantee or produce social progress.
A peculiar feature which presently attracted my attention was the presence of certain circular wells. Sitting by the side of these wells and peering down into the shafted darkness, I could see no gleam of water, nor could I start any reflection with a lighted match. But in all of them I heard a certain sound, a thud, 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 like the beating of some big engine. I resolved I would make the descent without further waste of time. And then I began to feel over the parapet for the climbing hooks. Weena gave a most piteous cry, and running to me began to pull at me with her little hands. I shook her off, perhaps a little roughly, and in another moment I was in the throat of the well. The descent down the shaft was effected by means of metallic bars projecting from the sides of the well, and these being adapted to the needs of a creature much smaller and lighter than myself, I was speedily cramped and fatigued by the descent. But though my arms and back were acutely painful, I went on clambering down the sheer descent with as quick a motion as possible. Glancing upward, I saw the aperture, a small blue disc, while little Weena's head, peering over the edge, showed as a round black projection. The thudding sound of the machine below grew louder and more oppressive. Everything save that little disc above was profoundly dark, and when I looked up again, Weena had disappeared. My arms ached, my back was cramped, and I was trembling with the prolonged terror of a fall. Besides this, the darkness had had a distressing effect on my eyes. The air was full of the throb and hum of machinery pumping air down the shaft. I was roused by a soft hand touching my face. Starting up in the darkness, I snatched at my matches, and hastily striking one, saw three stooping white creatures similar to the one I'd seen above ground in the ruin, hastily retreating before the light. Living as they did in what appeared to me impenetrable darkness, their eyes were abnormally large and sensitive, just as are the pupils of abysmal fishes, and they reflected the light in the same way. I have no doubt that they could see me in that rayless obscurity, and they did not seem to have any fear of me apart from the light. But as soon as I struck a match in order to see them, they fled, vanishing into dark gutters and tunnels, from which their eyes glared at me in the strangest fashion. I tried to call to them, but the language they had was apparently different from that of the overworld people. The thought of flight was even then in my mind, but I said to myself, you're in for it now. And feeling my way along the tunnel, I found the noise of the machinery grow louder. Presently the walls fell away from me, and I came to a large open space, and striking another match, saw that I had entered a vast arched cavern which stretched into utter darkness beyond the range of my light. Great shapes like big machines rose out of the dimness and cast grotesque black shadows in which dim spectral Morlocks sheltered from the glare. The place was very stuffy and oppressive, and the faint halitus of freshly shed blood was in the air. Some way down the central vista was a little table of white metal, laid with what seemed a meal. The Morlocks, at any rate, were carnivorous. Even at that time, I remember wondering what large animal could have survived to furnish the red joint I saw. It was all very indistinct. The heavy smell, the big unmeaning shapes, the obscene figures lurking in the shadows and only waiting for the darkness to come at me again. Then the match burned down and stung my fingers and fell, a wriggling red spot in the blackness. I've thought since how particularly ill-equipped I was for such an experience. When I'd started with the time machine, I'd started with the absurd assumption that the men of the future would certainly be infinitely ahead of ourselves in all their appliances. I'd come without arms, without medicine, without anything to smoke, even without enough matches. If only I'd thought of a Kodak, I could have flashed that glimpse of the underworld in a second and examined it at leisure. But as it was, I stood there with only the weapons and the powers that nature had endowed me with, hands, feet, and teeth, these and 4 safety matches. A hand touched mine. Lank fingers came feeling over my face, and I was aware of a peculiar, unpleasant odor. I fancied I heard the breathing of a crowd of those dreadful little beings about me. I felt the box of matches in my hand being gently disengaged, and the other hands behind me plucking at my clothing. The sense of these unseen creatures examining me was indescribably unpleasant. The sudden realization of my ignorance of their ways of thinking and doing came home to me vividly in the darkness. I shouted at them as loudly as I could. They started away, and then I could feel them approaching me. They clutched at me more boldly, whispering odd sounds to each other. I shivered violently and shouted again, rather discordantly. This time they were not so seriously alarmed, and they made a queer laughing noise as they came back at me. I will confess I was horribly frightened. I determined to strike another match and escape under the protection of its glare. I did so, and eking out the flicker with a scrap of paper from my pocket, I made good my retreat to the narrow tunnel. But I'd scarce entered this when my light was blown out, and in the blackness I could hear the Morlocks rustling like the wind among leaves and pattering like the rain as they hurried after. In a moment I was clutched by several hands, and there was no mistaking they were trying to haul me back. I struck another light and waved it in their dazzled faces. You can scarce imagine how nauseatingly inhumanly looked those pale, chinless faces and great lidless, pinkish-grey eyes as they stared in their blindness and bewilderment. But I did not stay to look, I promise you. I retreated again, and when my second match had ended, I struck my third. It had almost burnt through when I reached the opening into the shaft. I lay down on the edge, but the throb of the great pump below made me giddy. And then I felt sideways for the projecting hooks, and as I did so, my feet were grasped from behind, and I was violently tugged backward. I lit my last match, and it incontinently went out. But I had my hand on the climbing bars now, and kicking violently, I disengaged myself from the clutches of the Morlocks and was speedily clambering up the shaft while they stayed peering and blinking up at me. Westward, towards the rising country that is now called Coombe Wood, I observed far off a vast green structure, different in character from any I had hitherto seen. It was larger than the largest of the palaces or ruins I knew, and the facade had an oriental look, the face of it having the luster as well as the pale green tint of Chinese porcelain.
So far, which is one of the places the time traveller visits in 802-701, which is the Palace of Green Porcelain. He comes across what is effectively South Kensington, almost 1 million years from now. This is a museum complex which obviously begins to raise some reflection on the paradoxes of time. Because what are you going to find in a museum of the future? You might, for example, it's always seemed to me perfectly plausible, you might find the time machine in a...
I found the Palace of Green Porcelain when we approached it about noon, deserted and falling into ruin. Only ragged vestiges of glass remained in its windows, and great sheets of the green facing had fallen away from the corroded metallic framework. The material of the palace proved to be indeed porcelain, and along the face of it I saw an inscription in some unknown character. Within the big doors, which were open and broken, we found a long gallery lit by many side windows. At the first glance I was reminded of a museum. The tiled floor was thick with dust, and a remarkable array of miscellaneous objects was shrouded in the same grey covering. Then I perceived, standing strange and gaunt in the centre of the hall, what was clearly the lower part of a huge skeleton. My museum hypothesis was confirmed. Clearly we stood among the ruins of some latter-day South Kensington.
What he finds is ruin. Every single book in the vast library in the Palace of Green Porcelain is shredded.
The brown and charred rags that hung from the sides of it I presently recognized as the decaying vestiges of books. They'd long since dropped to pieces.
Almost all the machines abandoned, rusted, useless. Every monument, every achievement of urbanity has fallen to bits and is now neglected. So rather, it seems to me, than reading this as pure prediction, this is judgment. This is warning. This is without the kind of pressure that makes urbanity what it is. This is what our future will be, and it's no coincidence that it's best embodied in imagining a ruinous South Ken.
And now came a most unexpected thing. As I approached the pedestal of the Sphinx, I found the bronze panels were open. At that I stopped short before them, hesitating to enter. Within was a small apartment, and on a raised place in the corner of this was the time machine. I had the small levers for it in my pocket. I was surprised to find it had been carefully oiled and cleaned. I've suspected since that the Morlocks had even partially taken it to pieces while trying in their dim way to grasp its purpose. Now, as I stood and examined it, finding a pleasure in the mere touch of it, the thing I had expected happened. The bronze panels suddenly slid up and struck the frame with a clang. I was in the dark, trapped, so the Morlocks thought. I could already hear their murmuring laughter as they came towards me. Very calmly, I tried to strike the match. But I had overlooked one little thing. The matches were of that abominable kind that light only on the box. You may imagine how all my calm vanished. The little brutes were close upon me. Then came one hand upon me and then another. Then I had simply to fight against their persistent fingers for my levers, and at the same time feel for the studs over which these fitted. One lever, indeed, was almost got away from me. As it slipped from my hand, I had to butt in the dark with my head. I could hear the Morlock's skull ring to recover it. At last, the lever was fixed, and I pulled it over. The clinging hand slipped from me. The darkness presently fell from my eyes. I found myself in the same grey light and tumult I have already described.
Actually, it's worth remembering that there are other times that the time traveller visits in the time machine. So after he's gone to 802, 701, he then goes sort of much further into the future and sees how the planet is starting to change geologically and meteorologically. And then right at the end of the novel, which for me I think is perhaps the most interesting section, is he travels, I think, or he thinks, about 30 million years into the future.
For an indefinite time I clung to the machine as it swayed and vibrated, and when I brought myself to look at the dials, I was amazed to find where I had arrived. As I drove on, a peculiar change crept over the appearance of things. The alternations of night and day grew slower and slower, and so did the passage of the sun across the sky, until they seemed to stretch through centuries. I stopped very gently and sat upon the time machine looking round. The sky was no longer blue. Northeastwards, it was inky black. Overhead it was a deep Indian red and starless, and southeastward it grew brighter to a glowing scarlet, where, cut by the horizon, lay the huge hull of the sun, red and motionless. I cannot convey the sense of abominable desolation that hung over the world. The red eastern sky, the northward blackness, the salt dead sea, the stony beach crawling with these foul, slow-stirring monsters. I know, said the time traveller after a pause, that all this will be absolutely incredible to you. Take it as a lie or a prophecy. Say I dreamed it in the workshop. But taking it as a story, what do you think of it?
During the exact period that he was writing the final published version of Time Machine, his master, Huxley, had given one of the greatest science lectures of the 19th century, which is Evolution and Ethics, delivered at Oxford. And in Evolution and Ethics, Huxley makes the extraordinarily important point that human ethics are contradictory to the principles of Darwinism. Huxley's argument is that if humans are going to progress, they have to register their capacity to break with natural selection, that artificial selection, social ethics, are not given to us by the principles of Darwinism. Wells's book, finally, is an intervention in that extraordinarily important debate against what he calls, magnificent phrase, excelsior biology.
I stayed on waiting for the time traveler, waiting for the second, perhaps still stranger story, and the specimens and photographs he would bring with him. But I am beginning now to fear that I must wait a lifetime. The time traveler vanished 3 years ago, and as everybody knows now, he has never returned.